horas. Então, passo a palavra agora ao professor Asker Jeukendrup e é com muito gosto que o recebemos aqui nesta palestra. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. So, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for the invitation to speak on a very interesting topic that's close to my heart, and a very special person here who ran under 2 hours for the marathon, something that a lot of thought was impossible. And I'm going to talk about the science behind it, but particularly my area of the science, which is nutrition. So I'm going to start with taking us back to this record attempt, so you can enjoy a few seconds.
300 meters to go. We can see the finish line here. Neil Armstrong we had on the moon in 1969. We had Roger Bannister, the 4-minute mile 65 years ago. Edmund Hillary, the first man to climb Everest in 1953. We have 1 minute to go. Eliud Kipchoge is on his way here. This humble farmer who used to run 2 miles to school every day and back. He used to go to the nearest town on his bike to sell milk at the local markets. And now, through hard work and discipline, he's pointing. Come on, he says. Eliud Kipchoge has the hand of history on his shoulder. He has less than 200 meters to go. Eliud Kipchoge, let's keep an eye on the clock. Into the final 20 seconds. Eliud Kipchoge. Whoa! On his shoulder. 140. 140. Eliud Kipchoge storms into the history books in Vienna. 1:59:40, the unofficial time. The first man to run a marathon in under 2 hours. One final lung-busting stride for Kipchoge. One giant leap for human endeavor. And you know, Kipchoge was right. No human is limited. He's 300.
So that took us back. Incredible performance. And the question for today is, what does it take to run a sub-2-hour marathon? What can we do with science to support us, or what have we done with science to support us? So the graphic is from a website that I maintain, mysportscience.com, where I try to communicate science, sometimes very complicated science, but I try to make it understandable. I also try to dispel myths, quite a few myths that we have. So if you look at here, there is an area here that has to do with altitude, temperature, humidity, wind speed. So all of those things are important for performance. Some of them you can control to some degree by selecting where you're going to run the attempt. But usually for most people, the conditions are what they are. We have in yellow here a number of factors that relate to the physiology. Maximum oxygen uptake, running economy. I'll come back to those in a second. Of course, we talked about the shoes, footwear, apparel, the pacing strategy, pre-race nutrition. So this is actually the area that I'm going to focus on. So people who want to read the full research paper on this, it was published in November 2020. And in that paper you find a few numbers, because they did do a lot of measurements on Eliud Kipchoge, and the numbers are all published in this paper. So the body weight is fairly typical for a marathon runner, around 60 kilos, usually between 55 and 65 kilos. The oxygen cost here is 191, really low per kilometer, per kilogram per kilometer. And that means that he is very efficient. So he can run with the same amount of oxygen, he can run faster than almost anyone else. But I just want to, I think if you look at this record attempt, then shoes have played a big role. But we've already read a lot about the special shoes, the carbon sole, and how that helped. We've also seen that drafting probably plays an important role. They spend a lot of time figuring out what is the best and also the most practical way to form sort of an echelon that protects the, in this case, Eliud from the wind. And research projects have tried to simulate this in laboratory conditions. So they compared, for example, running alone, running behind a pacer, or in between pacers, or like as Eliud did here, like running behind the middle pacer. And you can model this, test things in a wind tunnel, and you get results like this. And you can figure out that if you run behind someone, it saves 1.91% in terms of power. If you run behind the group, or straight behind the group, 2.75, or if you run in the middle behind that little group, it's 2.84%. So they worked out the drafting strategy using modeling like this. But I want to spend time talking about nutrition, which we don't hear a lot about, but it's extremely important. And I'll show you some of the signs and some of the evidence of the strategy that was used. Now, on the left here, you can see Eliud Kipchoge, and I don't want to pretend that I worked with him directly, but this guy, Armand Betonville, is one of the guys who works in my team, in my nutrition team in Holland at the Dutch Olympic Committee, and he is the nutritionist for Eliud Kipchoge. So he should get the credit for the entire nutrition strategy. Having said that, it was very much built on the strategy that I used many years earlier with Haile Gebrselassie when he was trying to run a 2:04 marathon in Berlin. And Haile used very similar nutrition strategy twice to break the world record there. If we go back in history, and you look for the first research projects in the marathon, you find probably this paper that describes the marathon in 1924 and 1925 in Boston. And in 1924, they had a group of runners who ran from start to finish, and at the finish, they measured blood glucose. And it was observed that blood glucose was lower at the finish than at the start. So the next year, they gave them glucose during the run. And this time they observed that there was no drop in the blood glucose. They also observed that these runners were fast. Now, maybe not the best designed research project, but it's the first one. And since then, we have quite a few more studies that very consistently show that carbohydrate feeding during exercise can improve performance. One of the studies that got me excited in this whole field was this study published in 1986. It was in cyclists, but the principles are the same, and there are also studies in runners. They show the same things. So if you don't feed carbohydrate, like the runners at the Boston Marathon, over time, your blood glucose concentration will drop. Or if you ingest fairly large amounts of carbohydrate, you can prevent this drop. And you can also see that these cyclists here went, instead of 3 hours, they went 4 hours. So they were able to exercise longer. If we look at carbohydrate oxidation, so how much carbohydrate you use during exercise, we see the same pattern, a drop if you just drink water, or you can maintain it if you take carbohydrate on board. Now, I just want to take it from there because nowadays we have some technology that actually allows us, actually since about a year, we have this technology that allows us to measure blood glucose minute by minute, 24 hours a day, and actually for 2 weeks with just one sensor. So you apply one sensor once, you connect it to your phone, and you get your glucose trace for 24 hours a day, and every minute is measured. And that gives us huge insights in what happens during training, but also what happens in the lead up to training, what happens after breakfast, for example, between breakfast and training, or what happens even during sleep. So this is new technology that helps us to understand the body a little bit better. It used to be, well, it still is used by diabetes patients a lot, but now it's become available also for athletes. I want to talk a little bit more about this role of carbohydrate because we have these studies that show on the left-hand side that there's a relationship between carbohydrate intake and performance. The more carbohydrate you take on board, the better the power output, so the better the performance. And that is the principle that we worked with many years ago when I started in this field. We try to find ways to get more carbohydrate into the body. Now, the way we measure this is by using a carbon-13 labeled carbohydrate. So this is essentially a marker or a label that we add to the carbohydrate. That carbohydrate will be digested, will be absorbed, it will be used by the muscle, and then when it's used, it is expired as carbon dioxide. You can measure how much of that label that we've given ends up in carbon dioxide. And you can imagine that if more label ends up in carbon dioxide, it means that more of your drink or more of your carbohydrate was utilized during the run. So that's the method we used. It's a very accurate method that you can use. For example, in this example, you can compare glucose and galactose. And I'll show you just this example, which is fairly typical. 2 hours of exercise. Every 15 minutes, these were also cyclists, they received glucose or galactose. And you can see a typical pattern that for the first 60 to 90 minutes, there is an increase in glucose use from your drink, and then it levels off. And the maximum value here is around 0.8 grams per minute. For galactose, it's about half that. So I would conclude from this that glucose is a better energy source than galactose. So that technique allows us now to compare all sorts of different carbohydrates and even combinations of carbohydrate. So these are some of the carbohydrates that we have available: glucose, fructose, galactose, sucrose, maltose, lactose, maltodextrin, which we find in a lot of sports nutrition products, starches, and there's two types of starches, one that is very branched, one that's very straight. And some of these carbohydrates are very slow, some of these carbohydrates are very fast. The ones that we are looking for are the ones that are very fast, that deliver energy very quickly. When we look at all of the studies in the year 2000, they are plotted in this graph. Every dot here is one study, one outcome. On the horizontal axis here, you can see the ingestion rate of the carbohydrate. So in this case, it's 1 gram per minute, and it goes all the way to 3 grams per minute. That is 180 grams an hour, not something that I would ever recommend to anyone. But 1 gram a minute is pretty realistic. 60 grams an hour. The pattern that you see is that initially, when we ingest more carbohydrate, we also use more carbohydrate. But when we ingest much more than 1 gram per minute, it has no additional benefit. So if we take this example here, we take 3 grams of carbohydrate per minute, or 180 grams per hour, but we only use 60 grams an hour. That means a lot of that carbohydrate, 2/3 of it, is missing. Where is it? So that's a question that we had, and maybe it was sitting in the stomach. We quickly ruled that out. If we read the textbooks would tell us it cannot be in the intestine because your capacity to absorb carbohydrate is unlimited. It could be that the carbohydrate is stored in the liver, but we also ruled that out. We also ruled out that it had something to do with the muscle being limiting the uptake into the muscle or the use in the muscle. So we went back and said, well, maybe the textbooks are wrong. So this is an illustration of absorption. On the left here, this is the inside of the intestine. On the right, we have the blood. Absorption is the process of taking, for example, glucose from here through your cell or through the wall of the intestine into the blood. So if we look at glucose here, it is transported by this red dot here, sodium dependent glucose transporter 1, or SGLT1. The name doesn't matter. What we thought might happen is when we ingest large amounts of carbohydrate, that transporter becomes saturated, and the amount of glucose that you can absorb is therefore limited. A little bit similar to when we would all be sitting in one room and we open one door and say, now let's leave the room as quickly as possible. If the door is only small, the opening is only small, there's only so many people that can leave the room at the same time. And the only way to get more people out of the room is to open another door. There happens to be another door, and that is GLUT5. GLUT5 transports another carbohydrate, and that is fructose. So we designed a study to see if we would combine glucose and fructose, would that help to get more carbohydrate into the body? I won't go into too much detail, but I want to show you the 3 trials that we had in that study. One was glucose, and the amount of glucose was enough to saturate the transporter. We added fructose to that glucose, and then we had another control trial that was the same amount of carbohydrate, but this time all glucose. So this one I call medium glucose, then we go to high glucose, and then we go to the mix. And when we look at the results, very similar to what I've shown you before. There is an increase and then a leveling off, a plateau after about 90 minutes. This is the medium amount of glucose. If we give more glucose, guess what? We find exactly the same because the transporter may be limiting. Then the next drink had glucose and fructose. So we measured glucose separately. That was the same, but fructose was also used. So the total amount of carbohydrate now that was used, the red line here, for the very first time, we observed was over 1 gram a minute or 60 grams an hour. In fact, it was 50% more than just glucose. So we then started to look at many different combinations of carbohydrate, and we concluded in the end that the most practical and probably the best mix is a mix of maltodextrin and fructose 2:1. So even though here we find 1.75 grams per minute, and just when you think about it, that is 75% better than what we previously thought was the maximum that you could ever achieve. So these are not small differences. But this is the most practical and probably the best trial, maltodextrin and fructose 2:1. Now, there are no medals for how much carbohydrate you use. There are medals for how fast you complete a distance. So we started to do performance studies. And in this particular study, we found that glucose improved performance compared to placebo. So carbohydrate improves performance by about 9% after 3 hours pretty hard exercise. And that's not a small effect, but it is an effect that was described in the literature many times. What was new was that if you had glucose and fructose, that improved performance by a further 8% compared to glucose. So massive effects. It is about 17% compared to placebo. And this is not the only study here. It's just another example where they observed an 8% difference in a 100-kilometer cycling time trial. So the big question then was, is it the same for running and cycling? Because runners will tell you, well, you can't take that much carbohydrate on the run. And my answer is, yes, you can. And the results will be the same. It is just that cyclists are used to doing this and runners are not. So you need to train this. We also compared gels and energy bars versus drinks. And the bottom line of all these studies is that gels and drinks give pretty much the same effect. Bars may be a little bit slower. They may be a lot slower if they're not the right bars, if they have a lot of fiber and fat and protein. But it is essentially a carbohydrate bar, it'll be very similar to a drink. Good news for athletes because it means that you can have a strategy with drinks and gels and bars and mix all of that. So the mix that we looked at, these what we call multiple transportable carbohydrates, the maltodextrin and the fructose, we've shown that it improves the delivery of energy of carbohydrate, it delays fatigue, improves performance, it also improves gastric emptying, so there's less sitting in the stomach. It improves the delivery of fluid, so it also helps you with fluid balance, and very important, it reduces the risk of GI problems, of stomach problems. One last point I want to stress is that all of our recommendations are in grams per minute or grams per hour. And this is unrelated to the size of the athlete. A small athlete, say athlete of 60 kilos or a larger athlete of 90 kilos, you can see in this plot there really isn't a correlation between how much carbohydrate you can use and body size. So that's why the advice is always in grams per hour. So with some of the knowledge, I went to Ethiopia to work with Haile Gebrselassie. And a lot of this Addis Ababa is at altitude. The runners there train even higher. So Addis Ababa is at 2,450 meters. Mount Toto, where they train, is even higher. The temperatures in Addis Ababa are 21 to 26 degrees, but if you go up the mountain, it is a lot cooler. And just to give you a few impressions of the environment that we're dealing with, very different than the environment that many of our athletes here live in and train in. When I was there, I stayed with this couple. The runner on the left is Getawami, world champion in Ethiopia, and on the right is one of the very successful coaches. And this is the house where Haile Gebrselassie lives. And this is where he goes in the morning and trains. These are the trails. And you can see lots of different people running, and even kids running to school. They have one track in Ethiopia. This is a photo of the national track, and it was the only track at the time in the entire country. And a very large group of very fast runners, as you can see here. Their philosophy is like, there is no marathon in the world that has a field that is as strong as this, that has the depth of our training group. And that's true, because the slowest runner in this group is a 2:12 marathon runner. When I was there, they were just moving all of the runners to a new space, about 12 runners, and all of their belongings are on this truck here. This is the kitchen. This is their sports nutrition. These two ladies did the cooking every day. You can see the chopping board on the floor. So very different conditions to what we are used to. I went there one year with a lot of equipment and to measure Haile on a treadmill. And one of the missions was to figure out what is the best drink for him to use when he's going to attack the world record. And so we did a lot of measurements. And before I get to the measurements of the drink, I want to show you the measurements of economy. So economy is the oxygen cost of running at a certain pace. So you can see different speeds here. This is running very slow, 12 kilometers an hour for them. 20 kilometers an hour is very close to race pace. And then when they go faster, then this is still extremely economical. But the most economical, they are around race pace. What we want to do is very similar to the studies that I've shown you before. We want to give them a drink, and then measure how much of that drink is actually utilized, where the goal is, of course, to have a drink that delivers as much carbohydrate as possible and leaves as little as possible behind in the stomach and in the intestine. So we did this with this protocol, and we measured very high oxidation rates from the drink. We repeated this with different drinks, and ultimately we decided this is the best drink for the world record attempt. So to illustrate what we were looking for is if this is the total volume of drink that is provided, the yellow part is the amount that's actually used by the muscle. The red part is the part that we want to minimize. That is the energy that is not absorbed, that is maybe sitting in the stomach or sitting in the intestine. So we did this during training, hard training and racing, and we tried different drinks to make sure that the red part is as small as possible, so the residue in stomach and intestine is as small as possible. And we ended up with up to 88% oxidation, but extremely high. I have to say that this is also after a period of training the gut. So where you can train the muscle, you can also train the intestine to absorb carbohydrate. You do it by changing the diet and also by practicing taking on drinks during hard runs over and over. I want to finish off with just telling you about a little bit of software that we have developed. And this software is really based on some of the principles that we just talked about. The software is called Core. The website is fuelthecore.com. And you can get a free version of this software and just start planning your races. So you can see on the right here that there is a dial or a gauge for hydration and one for carbohydrates. So essentially you plug in what your event is, say it's a marathon. If you select for example, Boston Marathon, it will already download the weather conditions for the Boston Marathon. It will know what drinks are available on the course, and it'll ask you some questions about you, about how fast you think you're going to run, and then it gives you a nutrition plan, tells you exactly, this is where I would drink, this is where I would take a gel or something else. So that software you can just try and test. It's available on fuelthecore.com. And this is just an example of a plan. So essentially, if you get a plan, the dials are in the green, which means it is exactly according to the recommendations for you. And then I'll tell you what to do. You can then click on this plan if you want to change it, if you want to change a product or you want to change the timing of the intake. And all you have to do is watch these dials, because if you click on a product and it disappears, that has an effect, for example, on carbohydrate. So you need to add in carbohydrates somewhere else. So this is just a tool for people to play with. It is the science turned into an app, but it's certainly something that can help. The main message of this talk was really that nutrition can play an incredibly important role. It's often underestimated, and athletes like Eliud Kipchoge recognize the importance, spend a lot of time figuring out what works best for them, but it all starts with the science in the first place. So with that, I want to say thank you. I think we have some technical issues with answering questions, so therefore we're going to skip that. But if you have questions, then feel free to ask those questions through email at info@mysportscience.com. And thank you very much for listening. And who knows what the next record for the marathon will be. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Oeiras. 46 quilómetros quadrados de ideias e emoções com que damos forma ao futuro. Oeiras 27.